I'm John Gottfried, one of the co-founders of Major League Hacking, and I'm here with Michael Cheng from Facebook.
Hi, Michael Cheng, product manager at Facebook, one of the initial supporters of the Major League Hacking Fellowship.
We're going to be talking today about what makes the MLH Fellowship tick, why it's valuable for students, why it's valuable for companies, and what we've learned over the last year of working together. So I'd like to start, Michael, with a little background on how exactly we started working together, because it's kind of a novel story.
Yeah, so it was April or May of 2020, and the pandemic was raging, and we were hearing all these stories of students losing job and internship opportunities. At the same time, we were also learning that many projects in our ecosystem were struggling to get by because of work from home, because of losing their jobs, and a variety of reasons. Open source is a volunteer-driven activity, and by and large, folks are doing open source in their spare time outside of work. And so the pandemic had a huge impact on the overall sustainability of open source, and we were looking for something to address that. We somehow found each other, and together we built this program that has been wildly successful over the last year. One of the things that I was wondering, because I've been so engrossed in the fellowship, is what are the things that MLH does outside of the fellowship? What does MLH do outside of the fellowship, and what did you do before we started the fellowship?
The MLH Fellowship is actually a natural extension of what we've been doing for many years. Major League Hacking, our mission is to empower hackers. And so we've done that by creating the largest community in the world of early career developers who come together to learn in events like hackathons, workshops, meetup groups, and clubs on campus. And like you said, when we saw that many of them were losing these opportunities over the summer that were actually necessary to the beginnings of their career, we realized that we could take advantage of this wide reach we had, all of the learnings that we had gathered about how engineers actually work, and put that together into a program, which is the MLH Fellowship, that gives people the real-world experience they need to get their start in the industry. It sounds novel, but in many ways, we took the concept of an internship and abstracted it away so anyone could take advantage of it, regardless of where they lived, regardless of where they went to school, and in a way that really had an immense impact on both the students and the open source projects they were working on. In hindsight, it feels like a really obvious conclusion, but at the time, I don't think it was, right? It really was a reach in a lot of ways. And you, right, as one of our first partners for the program, made it possible for it to happen. And I'd love to hear, when you were looking at it in those early days, what was it that made it worth investing in?
We built this program together, and we invested in the program for two main reasons. The first is diversity, and the second is sustainability. On diversity, we all know how incredibly important it is to ensure that the products that we depend on are built by diverse people with varying perspectives. Mm-hmm. And the way that we structure the fellowship directly addresses that. The fully remote nature of the fellowship, combined with the diverse makeup of the MLH community who were applying to the fellowship, meant that every class of the fellowship had diverse representation. We were also successful at getting a lot of these diverse fellows the jobs that they wanted in tech. Diversity is also the main reason why we pulled together the Black Developer Scholarship in the fall. It is a scholarship designed to recruit students who identified as either Black or of the African diaspora to come hack on the fellowship. And that had an immense impact in increasing representation of Black developers in the scholarship, in the fellowship by 60%.
Yeah.
On sustainability, open source is a commons. Mm-hmm. It is a shared, finite resource that everyone depends on, and yet not enough is being done to contribute back to making it sustainable for the long term. The way that we constructed the fellowship directly addresses that because it mentors college students looking for practical experience on directly on open source projects to have an immediate engineering impact on those projects, solving technical debt, fixing bugs, resolving issues. And then it also lays the foundation for those contributors and those students to join the projects long term. And we've seen this time and time again, where the fellows who participate in the program during the term, their contributions are so impactful that at the end of the program, they're invited to join the maintainership as a full-time maintainer of the project that they contributed to. And these two things together have an immense impact on the long-term sustainability of the projects that we depend on and that everyone uses.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because open source is more often than not a labor of love for maintainers. And students, on the other hand, need things to put on their resume that aren't just class projects or side projects that they built, right? They need something meaty to put on there. And so it's almost this like perfect combination of a need on the maintainer side where they are strapped for time and resources, and a need on the student side where they need real world experience, both to gain skills and also to show off the quality of their work. And it, created a personal impact and a industry-wide impact in what they were able to accomplish together, right? And what we were able to accomplish together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to sort of double down on that labor of love point. It is a labor of love, but it is something, because it is a volunteer effort, it is something that people have to do, after they work a 9 to 5 and they get home, right? And when you get home after 9 to 5, you kind of want to work on the things that you want to work on, right? And what ends up happening, and I hear this almost every day from open source maintainers in the ecosystem, is that there's certain things that require quite a lot of technical expertise, but are just things that for one reason or another, like they just don't like doing, right? So they're pretty complex, they're varying complexity, but they just don't like doing. And this amount of technical debt just keeps piling up, right? And it affects the security, the health, and frankly the happiness of engineers who work on these projects, right? Because debt cleanup it's like working in a messy room, right? It affects your mood when you have to work in a messy room, right? And enter the college student who's looking for practical experience and who's eager to take on all of this work because it's all technically complex and challenging. And we've really solved two critical problems with one program.
Yeah, and you touched on something there, that there are a lot of different engineers working on this at a variety of different companies, right? And many of them are doing it as a side project, but there's this interesting disconnect where even though companies depend on open source as a foundational component of their business, they're not necessarily contributing back at the same rate that they utilize it, right? And I'm curious to hear, when you think about this in terms of the impact on the industry, what does that look like for the average technology organization?
Well, it is has the same effect of not knowing what your supply chain is. Open source is a software supply chain. It forms part of the software supply chain of every company. And most companies aren't looking very carefully into what's in their supply chain. At large organizations, supply chain management is a huge function, with thinking about various indicators of risk, from security to having only one supplier for a given component in a large complex product, to supplier diversity, whether the suppliers are promoting diversity in their workforces and promoting good practices, right? And none of that is being done at any meaningful level when it comes to the software supply chain. The president recently issued an executive order asking folks to look very carefully at software supply chains. So I expect that this is a trend that will improve over time. But in terms of the effect that it has, the effect can be, as we've seen with all of the security issues in open source, the effect can be quite devastating, just as bad as depending on something as an untrusted supplier for something that your company uses. So in the context of open source, it can mean that something that you depend on just disappears. It just doesn't, it's just not there when your dependency tree goes and crawls and calls for it, it's just not there, right? Or it can mean that somebody has inputted or maliciously put in a piece of code that then infects your technology stack. Or it could just mean that the maintainers are so burned out, right, that they don't release new versions. They don't fix bugs. And then when the companies that are trying to fix bugs upstream code to those projects, they're not merged into upstream, right? Which means creates a lot of downstream technical impact in terms of the features, in terms of the usability, and ultimately its utility in your company.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, incredibly relatable for anyone who's ever worked as an engineer, right? Like, we've all been in that experience where we try to use something and it doesn't function as we expected, or it breaks, out of nowhere because there was an unplanned change or deprecation, and that can have enormous repercussions for large companies.
Open source is an extension of the infrastructures that you have built for your developers, yep, right? And that your developer use to create value for your company, right? It is far more left of, when we talk about shifting developer practice left, it is even more left than the most left point, which is your developer's laptop, right? And not, or failing to account for the issues that arise in a critical part of your developer infrastructure is a major problem. And I think it's something that will require a lot of energy to fix going forward, and it's something that we're working on right now with the fellowship.
So, people might be thinking to themselves that the fellowship is a bunch of students, right? Like, it's a bunch of people early in their careers who are fairly junior, trying to solve what you're describing as an immense problem. How do you square that circle, right? Like, how do you reconcile those two things where on one hand you have foundational infrastructure, and on the other hand you have people who are just learning these skills, right? Like, how do you actually make that successful, and what have you seen in the program?
Well, I would say that the structure of open source makes that possible, right? Because there are multiple layers, right? There is the contributors, and there's just people, there are lurkers who just comment on projects. There's people who actually contribute by commenting on issues, discussing them. And then there's people who actually go through the process of writing and opening up a pull request. And then there are maintainers and basically owners of the project who ensure that contributions meet a certain quality, right? So open source by itself is a natural filter, right? And all that is missing is the people who show up to care, right? To people who show up to participate, right? It's a call for volunteers. The system itself is capable of creating numerous production grade and products that are running, that power everything that we depend on. It's just a matter of getting more people to help. And the fellowship that we built is one of the only programs that I've seen that measurably creates a steady pipeline of folks not only creating engineering impact when the program is running, but also creating, fostering and inspiring this next generation of contributors, right? That serves as volunteers who will power the production grade systems that open source produces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of the value for the ecosystem at large, right? Like, clearly, we're trying to harness energy and passion and put it towards a use that benefits the entire open source ecosystem here. And we do that both by leaning on the maintainers and all of those contributors, but also providing that extra layer of mentorship and teaching that kind of bridges the confidence gap in a lot of places, from someone who wants to work on open source, which more than half of our community members do, and then the people who actually successfully contribute. And that gap can feel really wide, but it's usually not a skills gap, right? It's usually a confidence or knowledge gap in how to actually go through the process. And I think that's where the program's been really successful.
It sounds really basic, right? That the confidence gap sounds really basic. It sounds really obvious. But in fact, most people, or most of the fellows that we've talked to, have cited that as the number one value add that they have brought out or they have come out of the program with, is the increasing amount of confidence, right? And when you think about how open source works, that confidence is crucial because it's just that little bit of a push to get them on the road to being mentored by folks outside the program, by maintainers and contributors at the whole range and universe of open source projects are ready there and ready and willing to mentor them. So the mentorship, in a way, opens up like orders of magnitude more mentorship for them. All they needed was just that little push and just someone to show them the way, and from there, they were able to learn almost anything in the open source world.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the novel things about Facebook, right, and this is not true of every company, is that you do have people whose job it is to work on open source, and yet the program has still provided value to those engineers. How do you quantify the ROI and value of this program that we've created together?
It does involve making a certain number of assumptions. We sponsored 10 fellows last summer, right? And this summer, 4 of the interns, full-time interns who participate in the Facebook mainline internship program are the MLH alumni from last summer. And I was totally blown away from that. And one person is in fact already a full-time engineer, and that was also amazing to see as well. And then I'm not even talking about like the impact on the ecosystem and the improving the health of the projects, but in the aggregate, when you put all it together, right? Every dollar that we put in the program is coming back to us like 5 or more times in the aggregate value, right? It's incredible.
Yeah, and I would guess that's a calculation that would apply to a lot of different companies, because for a lot of engineering organizations, their limiting factor is hours in a day, right? Like how much can their engineers take on? And so this serves that dual purpose of giving them extra resources while also training new engineers that can potentially join their team, and creating that actual impact on both the representation of people in the open source community and the quality of the projects that those businesses rely on, right? And
Absolutely.
So it has all these different factors that come together, even in organizations that have people working full-time on open source.
The other element of that is of course that not every company is going to know or has the capability or the resources to hire every type of engineer, right? Some companies, they may have a plurality of a certain type of engineer, and they may not be able to locate, or certain types of engineers may be a scarcity in the areas where they work, right? And because the MLH Fellowship is global and the distributed nature of it, when companies have a certain project that demands a certain skill set, either in terms of the language, the framework, or something else, we're able to source both the fellows from, and also the mentors mentoring the fellows who are able to create the results and with the skill sets needed by these companies.
The remote nature of the program allows us to tap into this talent pool that goes far beyond what most university recruiting organizations are capable of, even the best, most successful university recruiting organizations, because they have limited time too. And so, our community spans thousands of different universities, and as a result, the applicants to the program are from thousands of different universities. And it really does reveal people who might otherwise not even be aware of some of these opportunities, who are just as talented as a lot of engineers who are aware of those opportunities. And we see that really as like a democratization of career paths. And the hope is that we will be able to not just like find diamond in the rough candidates that go to school somewhere that is not on like the top list of tech schools, but almost like create a diamond mine where we are training those people who are really unique in the skills that they actually need to get noticed in a hiring process, and to have the confidence to get through a hiring process.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Obviously we've had a really successful year. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary. What do you see as the future potential of this program?
There's a couple of elements. I think the first, as I mentioned before, is really leveraging the incredible engineering impact and the incredible engineering sort of horsepower of the fellowship to attack the issues that we're seeing in the software supply chain. Right? I think there's a ton of potential there for creating significant public good just in that alone. On the diversity front, we've made immense progress, right? But one of the things that we've talked about and that we're planning to do, of course, is to not only, and I think you just also touched on this, is not only sort of look for the diamonds in the rough, right? But to actually create the diamond mine, which is to directly address the issues that have created this unequal access to tech by making it equal, right? The fellowship is by definition, equal to open to everyone, right? And figuring out ways that we can make it more open, more accessible, right? And truly draw upon more diverse populations is going to be a big priority and a big potential for the program. And lastly, I think growing the program, right? I think, Facebook has great success and a great experience so far, right? But we'd love to see a lot of other companies get involved, right? Not only on the sponsorship side, but also on the maintainership side, right? We fill kind of a dual role in that, one, we both sponsor the programs, but also we provide our maintainers time to help mentor the fellows, right? And we really need both for it to work. And so not only in terms of engagement and investment from other projects, but from other companies, having those would have incredible potential on our ability to scale the program.
Yeah. One stat that always strikes me is that for that initial batch of the program last summer, we had a matter of 20,000 applications in a couple of weeks for less than 200 spots.
Yeah.
Right? So there is enormous demand from people who are early in their careers. There is a wide pool of qualified people out there, and the limiting factor is bringing in more, partners and sponsors and maintainers to provide the access to learning that will help further all of these people's careers and have an impact on the software that these businesses depend on.
That 20,000 number was really striking to me. 200 out of 20,000 that were accepted, less than 200 that were accepted in the program, right? We had to scale down the funnel a little bit to make so that we wouldn't receive so many applicants, right? To make sure that we were getting applicants that were more serious. But even then, it was still orders of magnitude more, right? Eventually, I'd love to get to a point where we could, 2 or 3x just the funnel itself, right? And we can't really do that right now at our current scale, right? But at the pace that we're growing, I think it definitely could be a reality in the next couple of years, right? But again, that really depends on getting support we need, both in terms of companies who are supporting the project they depend on, but also projects who are opening up their projects for MLH to hack on.
Absolutely, I share that vision, and I thank you and Facebook for both making the program happen with us, but also supporting it so wholeheartedly over the last year. And I think we have a lot more to look forward to in the future.
Absolutely.